Welcome to the History Nerds United podcast. I am your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Today we have author Christine Kenneally with her book, Ghosts of the Orphanage. I want to say this up front. We're going to talk about this book being extremely heavy, extremely vicious. It is about a particular orphanage for the most part and a lot of the abuse that went on there for decades. I will say, if that's something that sounds triggering to you, the book is amazing, but it is heavy. It's almost going to sound like we're trying to talk you out of it at times during the episode. But I'm telling you, if that's something that you want to read about, or at least want to read a book that was amazingly well reported. I mean, Christine really dug in. She did the investigation. She looked under every rock. It's an amazing book, but it can be challenging for people who really want to stay away from things that go deep into some very nasty abuses that went on at this orphanage and a lot of orphanages around there. So Christine's book is fantastic. She's fantastic. I was so happy to talk to her. We don't talk about too much about specifics of the book in this episode. We kind of keep it a little bit high level. So if you want to listen and you think that'll be all right. But again, with any book like this, we're going to give you that warning. We do talk about abuse. If that's something that you want to skip, we'll be happy to have you back next episode. But with all of those warnings, I really love this conversation with Christine. She's fantastic. The book is fantastic. Let's go talk to her now. All right, here we are. Christine Kenneally with Ghosts of the Orphanage, a story of mysterious deaths, a conspiracy of silence, and a search for justice. Christine, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Brendan. I'm so happy to talk.
Now, I want to talk about you. I do want to get there, but real quick, I did a little bit of digging. You are pretty prolific in your own right, but your great-grandfather was pretty noteworthy as far as writing stuff. Can you tell me a little bit about him? Because I love this story.
I would love to. But first, let me say thank you so much for thinking that I'm prolific in my own right. You know, at this end, it never feels like it's quite enough, but I'm glad that I've given some people that impression. So my great-grandfather, his name was J.J. Kenneally, and in 1929, he wrote a book called The Inner History of the Kelly Gang. And it was non-fiction investigative account of Australia's most famous outlaw, Ned Kelly. A lot of people would know of Ned Kelly from the body armor that he created for himself, that sort of upside down tin bucket with the visor that he looked through and the chest plate. He had a sort of very famous last stand against a local Victorian police who were really the British constabulary at the time in Australia. So a lot of people thought of Ned Kelly at the time as a criminal, as an outlaw, and absolutely he broke the law. But my great-grandfather's book, was really what I like to think of as the true story, the true Ned Kelly story. And he reframed the understanding of Ned Kelly and he was a kind of an Irish freedom fighter, rather than just a criminal or an outlaw, which is what the police wanted people to think of him as. The book itself was really rigorous. He got hold of a lot of official documents. He also interviewed a lot of people as well. But he kind of had the inside track because the Kenneallys had grown up in this small country town next to the Kellys, next to the Kelly family. So he knew of the Kelly family. He was part of that world, and he understood in a way that outsiders didn't what was really going on behind the scenes. So it was really incredible for me because, you know, for me as a kid, books were sacred. I read all the time. I loved being inside books. It didn't matter if they were fiction or nonfiction or poetry or whatever they were. And to see his name on the cover of a book was incredibly special. And, you know, and as I grew up, I realized he'd actually had this extraordinary influence. So he hadn't just changed people's understanding of Kelly at the time. And that remains the understanding of Ned Kelly. It was a very modern view that he took, but he influenced other people. So Sidney Nolan, who's a very famous Australian painter, and a lot of people are familiar with his iconic series of images of Ned Kelly, which paint him in that body armor. Sidney Nolan spoke about being influenced by J.J. Kenneally's book when he created that series of paintings. And more recently, Peter Carey, the Australian novelist, wrote a book called The True History of the Kelly Gang, which, I mean, at least in title, if nothing else, is clearly influenced by my great-grandfather's book. It was really inspiring to see that you could do that you could write about true things and still tell incredible stories.
And now I wasn't making it up. You are prolific because just looking at all of the places you have articles at, it's a lot. I mean, we'll talk about a little bit about BuzzFeed, obviously, because of the book. But I mean, there's a lot of different publications. I always like to ask this question because people don't get it. Like, is it you go from one to the other and like, here's an article here, here's an article there, or it's like I was with this, source for a little while, or it's I have an article and I want to see who's going to print it. How do you kind of work in between different sources?
Yeah, so that's changed a lot over the years. So I've been doing this for a couple of decades now. I've worked as a freelance journalist for most of the time that I've been a writer. And the industry has completely changed in that time as well. Some would say it has completely collapsed in that time as well. And I think that's a pretty solid argument to be made for that. But generally, the process is that I come up with an idea and do a little bit of preliminary reporting. I might call a few people, just make sure the story is really there. It's not just something that I think I can see, but it's not really there. I write a lot about science as well as general stories and culture and history. And so when a scientific finding is announced that I find particularly interesting, or I read a scientific paper that I want to know more about, I might pursue that. And then I generally work out what publication I want to pitch that to. I'll pitch it. Sometimes I'm successful right out of the gate. Sometimes it takes a while and a story idea gets passed around to a couple of different places. And then if I'm successful, someone's willing to assign it and I'll write the story. That's different these days. Magazines don't work in quite the same way. A lot of stuff is online. 20 years ago, people would write stories for one particular publication and then you were able to syndicate your own work and sell it to different publications across the country, if not across the world. These days, because everything's digital, even though you are, strictly speaking, publishing in one country, you're kind of publishing across the world as well. So you can't do that anymore.
And now Ghosts of the Orphanage actually started out as an article first, right?
That's right. So in fact, I wrote my first article about this world, the world of 20th century orphanages and institutional childcare in 2012 for an Australian magazine called The Monthly. And I came to that article because I'd gone to a conference for archivists in Brisbane, Australia in 2012. Archivists are really interesting people, right? They know where the bodies are. They know where the documents are and the questions they face in terms of how to manage information flow, how to get information to the right people. It's really interesting to me. I was completely surprised to stumble into this presentation where these archivists were talking about a group of people who were fighting to get hold of really basic information about their lives. Information that just as a matter of course, most people have access to. The names of their parents, their own real names, in fact, the names of their siblings, where they grew up, who their family was. And not only had these people been somehow denied this information, there weren't really mechanisms in place either in the government now or in institutions or the remnants of the institutions that they'd been inside of to urgently fix this obvious human rights issue to get them this information straight away. So this was just completely extraordinary and intriguing to me, and that sort of that fundamental question that I often have when I come across a story, no matter what the story is, whether it's science or it's history, just like, how can this possibly be? So I started following that question and I started speaking to people who had been in these childcare institutions, who had spent that time in the orphanages. They started telling me these incredible stories. And overall, the stories were about administration and mechanisms of control and of dehumanization, such that I began to sort of think of these places as like these tiny totalitarian bubbles inside this greater democracy in which the rest of us lived, all these freedoms that we have access to. Somehow these children inside these institutions were completely denied. And they were exposed to really bizarre treatment, so that it was quite common, both in the United States, in Australia, and across the rest of the world, for kids to be assigned a number when they entered these institutions, and then they would be addressed by number, not by name. There was a TV show in the 1970s, I think it was out of UK, where one of the sort of the weird qualities is someone wakes up one day in this world where everyone's addressed as a number, not a name. But this actually happened, and it happened to loads of kids across the world. Another really sort of totalitarian part of this world for these kids was that they would be asked to do impossible things. And then when they couldn't perform these impossible tasks, they would be punished. So a really terrible example of that comes from St. Joseph's Orphanage in Burlington, Vermont. Although, again, this would have happened in other institutions where little kids had to go to bed at night and they were told that they had to lie and sleep in a particular position. So that to lie on their side, they had to clasp their hands as if in prayer. They had to put their hands on their pillow and their head on their hands. And they were supposed to stay there in that position all through the night as they slept. So I've spoken to people who recall being woken up with, a whack to the head from one of the nuns walking through the orphanage because they'd moved, their little bodies had moved in their sleep in the middle of the night. So these incredible stories. There's stories about abuse as well, and we can get into that later. But again, this question for me of how could this possibly be? How did this happen? Why did this happen? Who are these people? So I ended up writing about that for this Australian magazine. That's what I wrote about for this Australian magazine, and mostly just this sense of this weird informational world in which these people were forced to live, and this really important struggle to get these really tiny but incredibly significant pieces of information back about their lives. One thing I want to add to that is it was a really common experience of people in these institutions 10, 20, 30, 40 years later to finally have reached a point in their lives where they were willing to start asking themselves these questions. Who am I? Where did I come from? It's incredibly distressing and sad to even begin to ask those questions and to face the reality of all that's been taken away from you. But one of those questions for a lot of people was, do I have siblings? It was not at all uncommon for people to find once they started looking into it that in fact they did have siblings, that their siblings had been in the same institution they'd been in, and that they'd been there at the same time that they'd been in the institution as well. But the powers that be, and a lot of these institutions were run by religious organizations, deemed that for whatever reason, it was either not important to let them know they actually had siblings, or that it was better for them not to know. That's an example of just that kind of critical piece of information about someone's life that's sort of withheld. So I wrote that story, but there was still so much more to discover and so much more to learn. And it was also the case, I'm based in Australia right now. I lived in the United States for a long time. I have citizenship in both countries. I'm really proud of that, and I'm really grateful for that. And I noticed that I couldn't really find anything about orphanages in the United States. There was just no information. There were very few books. Most of the books were very obscure histories. Even, there are obscure histories and there are obscure histories, right? And I knew that in the rest of the world, there had been government inquiries, there had been investigations, there were memoirs written by people, there had been engagement, and there, as a result of all that engagement, this awareness was slowly filtering out across the culture. These places existed. These places were like this. The experiences people had were like this. But in America, it was just a great big blank. And it was just bizarre to me. How could this possibly be in a country this huge? How can you disappear a piece of history like that? So started looking, started poking, started talking to people. It became clear to me that the history was there. It had just been disappeared, essentially. And I pitched that story to BuzzFeed News. I was really lucky because BuzzFeed News was just kicking off at the time. They just hired this amazing, energized, dynamic person. Mark Schoofs was his name. He ran the investigative team, and he hired me to write this story for them. And the initial contract was for 1 year, and they extended it after 2 and then after 3. And I ended up taking 4 years to write one story. And I'm so grateful to them because it took 4 years to surface all the documents, to speak to all the people necessary to do that.
Unfortunately, there is so much. And this is a thing, too, to kind of, set up the book. I know when I first picked it up, I'm like, okay, Catholic orphanage, I know what's going to happen here. First, I really appreciate up front is this isn't just about, it's the Catholics again. You make that up front, like we're going to be talking about a Catholic orphanage, but there is a lot of people who have to answer for this entire system. It can't be just like this particular group or this particular group. And also, it's not just about a lot of the sexual assault that came out from the Catholic Church and all of that stuff. It's abuse in every single form in here. It's just some stuff that will turn your stomach and things that just really test whether or not you can believe it because it's so horrific. But I've thought it was interesting in the beginning. You're like, hey, like nobody lets off the hook here. Don't think that this is just one place. Like this was overall a system. And yeah, we're talking about one, but there were many. I mean, you even talk about it's across the border in Canada too. So the Canadians are not off the hook either.
Oh, no one is off the hook here. No one is off the hook. And there were hundreds. There were hundreds of these places in the United States. You know, it's really interesting. So there are very few historians who have really dug into this, and those that have, and I appreciate the work that those have done, but there is this line that I see repeated in the small number of books and documents that there are about this. And it goes something like this. You know, there were approximately 1,300 to 1,600 orphanages in the 1930s, and then the numbers declined after that. And it was eventually replaced by the foster care system. That is true enough. But the reality is that the system peaked at sort of 1,300 to 1,600 orphanages. That is a huge amount across the entire country. In some of those orphanages, there were small amounts of children. In some of those orphanages, there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of kids at a time. And this was a sort of rolling, rotating population. Kids might be there for 2 weeks at a time, 6 months at a time, 3 years, 10 years. So absolutely huge numbers of American kids passed in and out of this system. That continued well into the 50s and the 60s. Even if the overall number of orphanages were declining, the orphanage system was still very much up and going, and there were still huge numbers of kids passing through. Our general assumption was that it was a minimum of 5 million kids in the 20th century. And I think that's a very conservative number as well. So when you think of that number of people who've been influenced by the system in some way, you know, you've got to ask some questions about who put them there. And absolutely, the Catholic Church ran the most orphanages for most of the time in the United States, but there were many orphanages run by other religious institutions. I'm pretty sure all of the major religions had them. But states ran orphanages as well. States funded orphanages as well. They were everywhere. There was state support, state involvement, not enough, clearly, for most of the history of these orphanages. There was very little transparency to the outside world. There was very little questioning. And, you know, and that's on the community. That's not just on the particular religion that ran the orphanage. That's on the community as well. And then, you know, when you think about all the ways that everyone is implicated in the system, and we need to think about all of these layers so that this kind of thing can never happen again, then it's also the case, you know, a lot of the people who came out of these orphanages had really serious PTSD. They were absolutely traumatized. And it took them years to even begin to acknowledge that they'd been in one. Lots of people never told anyone. They lived the rest of their lives. They married someone. They were married for like 50 years, and they still never told that person they were married to that they'd been in an orphanage. It's incredibly hard. The ones that were able to tell initially, and this is prior to the Spotlight investigation, the Boston Globe Spotlight investigation of 2002, when they showed that not only was there a shocking number of parish priests sexually abusing kids, but also that the hierarchy had been covering it up and knew all about it. Before that, in this sort of dark time when no one really believed that that kind of thing could happen, those really brave individuals who tried to tell their story were often disbelieved. You know, whether it was disbelieved by a friend, by someone close to them, or by authorities. People did try to report to authorities. All throughout the 20th century, there are stories of kids running away from these orphanages and running to an authority figure in the community, whether it was the police or somebody, and telling them what had happened. And these stories are just devastating because it was almost always the case that they were not believed, and then they were returned to the institution where they'd escaped.
Something that really, besides the horrors, and I'm going to say horrors a lot, and I should say I love the book.
That's right.
I really do love the book, but at the same time, and I write this in my review, it is going to ruin your day. Like it's a very excellent book, but it's going to ruin your day. You have to be in the right mindset. Besides the horrible, horrible things, one fact that absolutely floored me is we say orphanage, we think orphan, and we say all of these kids have dead parents. Was that always the case?
Yeah, no, absolutely not. In fact, it was rarely the case. So what we think of as orphans are almost always never orphans, certainly in context of these 20th century childcare institutions. So For St. Joseph's Orphanage in Burlington, Vermont, which is one of the big stories in my book, over the course of its history from approximately the 1860s to the 1970s, about 13,000 kids passed through that place. The stories of the children that I was able to look into, mostly between the 1930s and the 1970s, and in some ways, obviously, it was a sort of an arbitrary set of people because I found the documents that I was able to find. I tracked down the people I was able to track down. But, that said, I read the stories of and interviewed lots of people who had been through that orphanage. And of all those people, and certainly in the hundreds, one of them was what we think of as a full orphan. And, I don't think the word irony is probably strong enough for this, but in this completely awful way, this girl both of whose parents had died was teased and subject to cruelty in the orphanage because she was a full orphan. That in and of itself is kind of extraordinary. So for a lot of the rest of these kids, they ended up in orphanages for lots and lots of different reasons. But I think one of the most common elements for all of their different stories was poverty, right? And all the different kinds of powerlessness that accompanies the experience of poverty in the United States, and certainly the poverty of the 1930s, the poverty of post-World War II America, are the different kinds of hidden poverty. So lots of kids had one parent missing. Perhaps they died. They might have been killed in World War II. Perhaps they had cancer. They died from illness. They've gone missing in some way. In a significant number of cases, the kids had both parents and they had split up. Certainly within the Catholic communities, divorce was supposed to never happen. And it was this really shameful, stigmatized event. And so in those situations, the parish priest might encourage the parents to send their kids to an orphanage, to get a good education, to be looked after within the church so that they didn't have to experience the shame of their newly single mother.
It seemed almost kind of like a long-term babysitting service. It's like, 3 kids is a bit too much right now. Let's put the older one in there for a little bit while we figure things out. And then maybe we'll go grab them back or visit them on the weekend like it's a prison or something.
That actually happened a lot. Kids went in and out in that way. But people struggled just to put food on the table. The stories of food poverty are really, really incredible. And absolutely, it was the case that some kids were grateful because their home life was one of terrible abuse. And they really wanted to and needed to escape out of that. Some parents were addicts. They themselves were abusive in some way. But really, the common denominator was poverty.
You go into this as if I'm trying to solve a crime. I know the crime was there, but I'm going to verify it and I'm going to show it to you. Which means when you talk to these people, you can't just say, hey, tell me everything and I'm going to believe every single word and I'm not even going to check it. How do you even have that conversation? Try and remember something and talk to me about something that you've probably tried to never think about, that never should have happened to you, that's not your fault. But now unload this to me and I'm going to write about it. How do those conversations even happen?
Yeah, that's a really good question. They happen in different ways. So, just very practically, as far as St. Joseph's was concerned, I was able to get hold of a huge number of documents from the 1990s. Those documents included names of people who had testified in some way. And so I tried to track them down 20 years later to see if they were willing to talk to me. And often I reached out to people by email first, or I found some way of getting them a letter or some message through social media and just giving them a chance to review what I was actually asking for, explain who I was, what I wanted to talk about, to give them a chance to say no if they wanted to say no, but also to give them a chance to think about it and say yes if they wanted to consider it. But there were certainly enough people who I could not find through those informational channels, but I was able to locate address. So I went and I knocked on their door and I explained who I was and I asked if they'd be willing to talk to me. I think the most important thing with this kind of work is you've just got to respect people's boundaries, right? If someone says no, no means no, let them be. I don't try to persuade people to talk to me if they're reluctant in any way. I don't try to sort of influence their decision. I really want them to feel like they can say no and that will be respected. It's really helpful to have a preliminary conversation that's not diving straight away into that really difficult stuff, and just to give people an opportunity to get a sense of who you are. And just if you're the kind of person they might be willing to trust, because I think that's what it really comes down to. If they get a sense of you as someone who's basically trustworthy, you don't necessarily have time to explain every nuance or detail or constraint. I try to explain the basics about journalism. If you say something is off the record, then it's off the record and I cannot write it at all. If you say it's on background, then it's something that you want to discuss with me, but I'm not going to in any way attribute it to you or associate your name with it. Just, the rules of engagement are really important, but you can't pre-account for everything. But if you can have a conversation with people and just be real with them and give them a sense of where you're trying to go with this, then a lot of people were willing to say yes. And that was really incredible to me. And I was really grateful to that. And it was really clear to me every single time that it took a huge amount of courage. People want their stories to be heard. They want the acknowledgement. But a lot of these people had experienced just the incredible trauma, not only of having gone through what they've been going through, but of being disbelieved afterwards as well.
Something that you did that I have not seen, when a lot of time people are writing about true crime and, you're taking victims who are alive. I remember getting about 3/4 of the way through the book and just horror upon horror upon horror. I started to get to the point where I'm like, you know what? I know we talk about these days, right? Believing victims and understanding and listening. But there's so much in here. You get to the point where you're kind of like, is there not a single good person in this entire story? Is there just no one? This was just absolute disaster everywhere? And you even let that shine through yourself, which I've never seen an author do this, where you said, you know what? I had to check myself and say, hey, am I on the right track? Am I looking at this the right way? Am I asking the right questions? Where you actually take a step back and say, there is so much terror. Is it all true? Am I going to take it all? Or can I ask the question and say, step back and say, do I have the evidence here to believe this? Do I have the evidence to write this down and put it out there? And I've just never seen an author do that before. Was that just something you're like, I need to put this in here, that my doubts crept into my own head at one point?
Yeah. I'm so glad that you noticed that and that was meaningful for you, because it was very important for me to include that in the book. I absolutely had the experience of initially stepping into this world and thinking, well, this is incredible, but how can this really be true? This is so extraordinary. How can this be real? And, what I now think of as it's a very human, but ultimately, unfortunately, kind of a naive point of view, which is that, man, if this had really happened, then someone should have done something about it by now. Someone would have done something about it by now. But I wanted to know if that was true too. Is that the case? Would someone have done something about it? Is it possible that these crimes occurred and they were covered up so completely and the victims were so utterly terrorized that even though they happened absolutely everywhere, we don't actually know about them right now? So that was a real experience, but my job as a journalist is to tell the truth, and it's to trust, but always to verify as well. And it was certainly the case that I also came to feel these stories are so important. If they are true, the world needs to know about this. It's just so wrong that these things could have happened and for this to have been suppressed and to have been disappeared and to have been hidden from sight. So I had that experience, and I also wanted to validate what I was pretty confident that the reader would also be having that experience as well. And I wanted to show that that was actually a normal human response, and also to suggest to them that when you have that initial resistance in a situation like that it's worthwhile just pausing and asking yourself, well, wait a minute, could this be true? And what kinds of evidence would I need for it to be true? And in fact, there is, now that the stories are starting to come out in the United States, and they've come out, as I say, through other channels elsewhere in the world, there is a massive body of testimony and of evidence to validate all of the stories told by all of these people. And it's reasonable and it's right that we should expect to see that body of evidence as well. It's absolutely appropriate. And it goes to the validation of the victim stories as well, to find ways to prove it, not just to accept it without really showing that it's real.
And I mean, you did go full detective on this a lot. I like, the best example is, of course, not to get too far into it, but somebody may have been pushed out a window, or I won't go deep into it because it's all there, but you're diving back into places where there aren't records, where people are trying to remember things from years ago. And in this particular one, it's, I think Sister this pushed this person who was hanging outside a window. And it's like, all right, you show that you have to go back and say, well, I think they said it was Stacy, but it, might have been Cassie over here, or maybe it was this. And you had to go and just kind of cross-check everything. And it's all in the book where you are verifying and you're saying, okay, hold on a second. I'm going to tell you whether or not this actually happened because I checked this, this, and this. Was that something, as you said, like you have to verify? Or is it also, in addition to that, it's like, hey, if you're starting to have the doubts that I have, let me show you the work so that you understand I didn't leave any stone unturned here.
Yeah, no, it was absolutely both of those things. It was really important not to leave any stone unturned. The story about the kids being pushed out the windows, I mean, that was one of those stories that was just so extraordinary. I had to know, and I had to, as you say, I had to turn over every stone that I possibly could. And I was lucky that I was able to take the amount of time that I did because time was such a critical ingredient in that investigation. A lot of those things took years to actually pull together, which is another reason why we don't really know about these histories right now, because the work required to really validate them, it just takes a lot of time. There's another story that was very similar to the window story, which was one of the main characters in my book, because I really try to tell the stories from the experience of the individuals who went through these places. She spoke about being put in a chair in the attic of the orphanage and strapped in. She said there were leather straps on this chair. They bound her wrists. They bound her feet, they bound her head. And the nun who did this to her told her that she was going to fry in that chair. Now, this was at a time when people were being put to death in the electric chair in Vermont and in the United States. So it was a very real prospect for this girl. That at the time felt to me like something so completely outlandish. I really struggled with that one. And and just this question of like, well, what was that chair doing in the attic in the first place? I mean, obviously that's not standard equipment for orphanages, as, strange as these places sometimes are. How on earth could a chair like that have gotten into the attic? So that was one of the questions I wanted to answer. How could people have gotten a chair to the attic? In fact, there was a sanitarium next door that the church took over. That was for people with mental health issues. It may have been a chair for administering some kind of electrical therapy there. The Sisters of Providence who ran St. Joseph's Orphanage were very closely connected to their mother house in Montreal and Quebec. They ran hospitals, psychiatric hospitals, and orphanages up there as well. When you start to uncover not just that one incident, but a whole world, right? That whole historic moment, then you can begin to see the pathways and the possibilities that, looking back from the vantage point of now, don't seem possible. But the real clincher for me was a few years into the investigation and a few years after I'd first heard this story. I asked everyone I spoke to, did you ever see a chair like this? Did you ever come across this chair? And everyone just said, no. So I really despaired of this because not only was it a strange story that I wanted to be able to prove one way or the other, it made me concerned about the veracity of this particular character, right? There were a lot of stories she had to tell. And if there was one story and it seemed so outlandish to me and it couldn't be proven, it made me wonder about whether I needed to, about whether I could believe her stories. At any rate, I spoke to a woman. She was living in the South. We had a phone call. She's just an absolutely lovely woman. She's one of those, going to your question before, she's one of those women. I called her up out of the blue. I told her what I was doing. I told her why I wanted to do it. And she spoke to me for about an hour or two, just telling me her stories of her time in the orphanage. And just as a matter of course, in this phone call, I hadn't actually asked her this question. Out of the blue, she said, one day my sister and I crept up into the attic. This was in the year 1960. And we saw a chair up there and it had leather straps on its arms and leather straps at their feet and leather straps near their head. And we were so terrified. We ran away and we never told anyone what we'd seen. So just right there, it was real.
I had 13 years of Catholic school, so I already have a healthy fear of nuns in the first place. But you talk to them, right? There are some that would talk to you. And once again, for the lack of, I don't want to kiss your butt too much, but again, I love the book. You let them talk, and you don't try and make them just evil. And there is a part of it too where I think about it. It's corporal punishment was not that looked down upon.
No.
And it was almost like for some of the nuns, they're like, oh yeah, that happened. Like that's how we disciplined. That this was how we did things. And of course we know just how terrible that is today. And to be clear, a lot of the things in here were not okay, right, to anyone back then if everyone knew about it. But there was a certain level where with some of these nuns, they're like, well, yeah, that happened. But like, that's just, we have all these kids and we're trying to discipline them. And you kind of just let a little light in there that, you know what, this is an institution where a lot of people were set up to see the wrong thing. They're set up to fail, and then they can be ostracized themselves if they don't get into line with what's going on with the culture, right?
Oh, I think that's such an acute observation. Everyone was set up to fail in so many ways in this institution, except, may I say, the priest who was in charge, who was absolutely not set up to fail and was supported in every way. But generally, there are around 20 to 28 nuns who were there at any one time. A lot of these nuns were girls off the farm. They're straight off the farm in Quebec. You know, they were the ninth of 10 kids, and they were the ones that the family wanted to be a nun, wanted to give to the church, so to speak. Some of them finished their education in elementary school. Some of them only had a few years of upper education. And then they were sent to these places, and they also had to obey in the same way that the kids had to obey. Obedience was absolutely one of their key principles. And one of the nuns, you know, who did some pretty awful things to these kids, and I believe them, she was a kid herself when she went into this institution, when she joined the religious order. And she told me about getting in trouble from the older nuns because she herself liked to slide down the banisters, not at the orphanage, but in the original convent in which she was trained. So she was a kid. She didn't have a lot of education. She didn't have a lot of support. All those totalitarian principles, right, of control, of dehumanization, was something that a lot of these women were subject to as well. And then absolutely, of course, you know, at the time, you know, the spectrum of abuse that these kids experienced in the orphanage included things just like being rapped on the knuckles. And, you know, that anyone who grew up in the 40s, the 50s, or even the 60s would recognize that as really familiar to them as well. That there really was, in many ways, it was just the way things were. And in the same way that these poor kids were put in impossible situations and expected to somehow survive and conquer them, so were many of these nuns as well, expected to be accountable for 20, 30, 40, often really distressed children, to feed them, to clothe them, and to get them to behave. Many of the kids I spoke to, as real and frank as they were about the devastating things that happened to them, you know, they saw that too. They understand that that just wasn't possible for a lot of these young women who were nuns.
Now, I know when I finished your book, what I really wanted to do was take a really long hot shower and have a cry in the corner.
Oh my God.
Before this interview, though, I thought about this, and we chatted a little bit right before we hit record, and I talked about, you know, there's a lot of PTSD from this. I have it myself, you know, from my time in the military. And what I thought about is, for you, how do you deal with it? You had to really, really go in deep here, and your life became these horrific stories. How do you, as a writer, protect yourself so that, you know, this doesn't kind of bring you down? You know, you've got family, you've got friends, you've got all of these things, and you got to make sure that you're an author, you're going to bring it home with you, but you have to kind of make sure that you don't bring yourself down with it. What did you do?
Yeah, you're right. And that was really hard to do. And secondary trauma is real, you know, and journalists experience it, and first responders experience it, and people in the military experience it. And you have to be aware of that, and you have to manage it. So early on, I certainly had the experience where, you know, I kind of came to, after just days and days and days at my desk, being inside this documentation, reading these first-person accounts of these kids in these orphanages, in these situations of not just abuse, but I think it's the powerlessness that's really hard to absorb. And particularly when you're reading many, many, many stories at the same time. But, at the same time, these are stories with suspense and drama, and they're incredibly hard to walk away from too, just because they are amazing stories. But I certainly had the experience where I just sort of snapped to and realized, oh my God, I need to go for a walk right now. I need to walk away from my desk. I have to actually just stop reading. And I have to take a break. And I got better throughout the time that I was reporting this story at taking breaks, at the simplest level, right? Just taking breaks like that. But, I certainly at different times I spoke to therapists because I felt pretty overwhelmed by all of it. And I needed to speak to someone who understood trauma and not just the kind of secondary trauma I'm experiencing, but someone who could validate and witness for me what this population of kids had gone through. That was just a really basic human need for me throughout it. Early on too, it became clear to me I was spending so much time inside my head, and my head had become a pretty dark place. And I just understood that it was really important to spend time in my body as well. And so I made a commitment to just stay fit and to work out as much as I possibly could for the entire time I was doing that. And I kept that commitment. And I think that really made a lot of difference to me.
It's very interesting. Just as you're talking about it, I'm thinking about it, and the feeling from the book, some of it's revolting, some of it's just plain sad. And especially, having a child, there were certain things that really hit me hard. But as you were talking, I was thinking everyone in this book felt isolated. Thankfully, they grow up and some of them were able to move on and doing those things. But especially it felt like at the orphanage, and I mean, everyone felt isolated. The orphans, the nuns, right? The janitorial staff, all of these people, going into the military or going to boot camp, it's not a great experience, but you're kind of building teamwork and you're doing these things. And it seemed like this entire system made it so that no one ever felt safe with anyone else there. And if they did, they were going to try and break that up as soon as possible. Or am I in my head now? And I'm thinking about this too much.
No, you are absolutely right. And I think that's what's the totalitarian part of it, right? Like that is the actual goal of the system. And it worked. People did feel isolated. Everyone did feel isolated. That's why people felt so stigmatized when they came out of these places and they didn't feel they could talk about it for a really long time. One of the first people I spoke to in Australia told me about his experience of connecting with a woman who actually started an activist group and has done incredible things here and really brought a whole community together. He said he felt like Jesus Christ walking on the water after he spoke to her that very first day and told her what happened to him, because she told him and he believed her. He understood it wasn't just him. It happened to so many people. He was not alone in his experiences. And it's so powerful to get that validation after going through something like that.
Well, one of the questions I usually ask at the end of this, and I'm going to have to mix this up a little bit because it's really disrespectful to ask it the normal way, but normally I ask, right, like people don't like history, they think it's boring, they think they read it in school and then they're done with it. Which for this book, I don't think it's the same question. I think for this is, A, assuming that you can read something like this, right? And there'll be disclaimers all over the place that this is heavy. It's very, very good, but it's very, very heavy. For somebody who can handle it emotionally, what would you say to them when they say, like, this sounds heavy, lady, I don't know if I should read this? What would you say?
So first of all, I would say make your own decision, and I want to respect everyone's boundaries, in the reading of the book as well as in the reporting of the book. If you don't feel it, you're up for it, please don't read it. That's totally fine. And I'm sure you can contribute to the world and even to these people in all sorts of ways. But if someone is just maybe asking, should I read it? Or, what if I read it? I would encourage people because, first of all, there's just the human stories are amazing. And there's a lot of horror in there. But there are just really basic human experiences. These are sort of extreme versions of experiences, but as you would find with books about war and books about being a refugee or an immigrant in some way, extreme but fundamentally human experiences and questions about belonging and making your way in the world and what kind of support you need. And there's a lot of suspense and there's a lot at stake. And ultimately, this is a word that's used a lot these days, but there is incredible resilience. These people that came together in the last few years out of this experience have created extraordinary change in Vermont, and that change is going to affect people across the states as well. So there are the human stories, but also I am personally still incredibly energized by this mystery of how do you disappear an enormous chunk of one of the biggest nations in the entire world? How do you disappear an enormous chunk of their history? How does that even happen? How can you do that? And how do we snap out of the sort of the spell that I guess has been cast over us in the disappearing of that? And how do you make sure that it doesn't happen again? I think that's really important too. But there's actually a really poignant reason that I think a lot of people are going to end up reading the book and will get something out of it. And that is not just for the 5 million plus kids who pass through this system, but for their kids and their kids' kids. So whether they told their families that this had happened to them or they didn't tell their families that this had happened to them, a lot of people, there's clearly a kind of intergenerational transmission that occurs. You can't have an experience like this and it not affect in some way potentially your parenting as well as the rest of your life. I had an experience while I was reporting the book where, and this happened many times, but there's one particular call I want to tell you about. I phoned a man up and I said, explained who I was, explained what I was doing. And I asked if I could speak to his mother. I'd found her name on a list of names and I'd verified that this woman whose current phone number I found was actually the woman who'd been in the orphanage 40 or 50 years before. He told me his mother had passed, but he asked me more about the story. And he did not know that his mother had spent time in an orphanage. So just because I wanted to sort of share with him, I, explained how I came across her name and the context of that and explained what orphanages were like and the kinds of things that occurred in orphanages. And, I called this man out of the blue. He had the time to speak to me. We're 20, 30 minutes into this conversation. And he said to me, "Oh my God, you've explained my whole life to me." And so I had unintentionally delivered this enormous piece of this emotional puzzle that he'd been struggling with because of the ways that his mother behaved and the ways that she treated him that he did not understand. And then learning that she'd been through this experience in the orphanage made so much sense to him. A whole lot of stuff fell into place. And that happened again and again for me throughout the book. So people, after reading the BuzzFeed article, wrote and said, "Oh my God, my mother was in an orphanage. My dad spent time at this place. He never spoke about it. He was angry his whole life. Now I understand why." I think that's a really important part of this mission, to get this story out, to connect with all the families as well, and to let them know, look, this happened. If this happened to your parent, maybe this is one of the reasons they are the way they are.
Well, Christine, thank you so much for writing the book. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure to speak to you, Brendan. Thank you.
And that is it for this episode. Christine, thank you so much for coming on. Ghosts of the Orphanage. It's a great book, everybody. In the meantime, hit us up Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, listen to the other episodes of the podcast, give us a rating, leave us a comment, 5-star rating if you wouldn't mind, and anything else. Send us emails. Go to the blog, send us emails. Let us know what's up. We love hearing from you. We really appreciate you listening and interacting with us. Until next time, stay cool, nerds.
History Nerds United.